The day my son's girlfriend called me a dirt poor old fool in front of her entire family, she was smiling when she said it, not even trying to hide it, just standing there in that dining room with the chandelier overhead and the white linen tablecloth and the good china, smiling at me like I was something she'd scraped off the bottom of her shoe. I had driven 4 hours to be there. 4 hours in my old pickup, the one with the cracked dashboard and the heater that only works if you hit it just right on the left side. My son Hank had called me the week before, nervous in that way he gets when he's trying to ask me something difficult. Lots of throat clearing, lots of, "So, Dad, I was thinking," and told me that his girlfriend's family wanted to have dinner. A proper introduction. Her father owned 3-car dealerships across the county, and her mother had gone to Vanderbilt. They lived in one of those new developments outside Nashville, the kind where every house looks exactly alike but costs $500,000. I told Hank I'd come. Of course I would come. I'm 63 years old. I spent 40 of those years running a cattle operation in eastern Tennessee. Not a big one by anyone's measure, about 800 acres, 150 head at peak, some hay fields I leased out to the neighbors. I know what my hands look like. I know what I smell like after a morning of work, and I know how people in certain rooms look at me when I walk in. I wore my best shirt, dark blue, pressed, my good boots, not the work ones. I drove 4 hours, and I brought a bottle of Tennessee whiskey from a small distillery near where I live, because that is what a man brings when he meets someone's family. Her name was Courtney. No, wait, I need to start over on that. Her name was Sloan, and her mother was the one who said it. I need to back up a little so you understand what happened. Hank had been with Sloan for almost 2 years by then. I'd heard about her, smart, pretty, worked in marketing for some firm in Nashville, but I'd only seen her twice, briefly, when Hank brought her up for a weekend last summer. She was pleasant enough. Polite the way some people are polite when they're deciding whether you're worth more than politeness. I noticed she didn't touch the iced tea I poured her and kept checking her phone at dinner, but I figured that was just youth. I figured I was being an old man about it. What I didn't know yet was what Sloane's mother, Diane, had been saying about me. I found out later, after everything that happened, that in the weeks leading up to that dinner, Diane had been telling people at her church, at her tennis club, at her weekly lunches with the other women in that neighborhood, that her daughter was, unfortunately, involved with a boy whose father is some kind of farmer. The way she said, farmer, like the word itself had mold on it. But I didn't know any of that when I pulled up to their house that Saturday in October. The house was large, tan brick, black shutters, a 3-car garage, the kind of landscaping that requires a crew. I parked my truck at the curb because I wasn't sure about the driveway, and I didn't want to be presumptuous. I grabbed the whiskey, smoothed my shirt, and went to ring the doorbell. Sloan answered. She looked surprised to see me, which was odd, since she'd presumably known I was coming. Then I heard her mother's voice from inside. "Is that him? Is that Hank's? Oh?" Diane came to the door. She was dressed like she was going to a fundraiser, pearls, a blazer, heels inside her own house. She looked at me. She looked at my truck at the curb. She looked back at me. And then she turned to Sloan and said, in this low voice that she clearly didn't bother to lower enough, "He looks exactly like I expected. Just some dirt poor old fool." She thought I couldn't hear her, or maybe she didn't care. I stood there for a moment. The whiskey bottle was in my hand. My first instinct, honestly, was to get back in my truck. Just turn around, drive 4 hours home, and let Hank figure out his own life. That's what pride tells you to do. Walk away before they can see that it landed. But then Hank appeared behind them in the hallway, and his face told me everything. He had heard it. He was looking at his girlfriend, then at her mother, then at me, with this expression I hadn't seen on him since he was about 9 years old and broke a neighbor's fence with the tractor, and had to go tell the man. He pushed past both of them and came to the door. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Dad, come on in. You're the most important person at this table tonight." Diane's face did something complicated. We went inside. I won't pretend the dinner started well. Sloane's father, whose name was Terrence, was the kind of man who talks about money the way other people talk about the weather, constantly, casually. as if everyone's first concern when they wake up in the morning is their portfolio. He had the soft handshake of someone who hasn't done physical work in 30 years, and the loud voice of someone who has never had to listen carefully to anything. He asked me, within the first 5 minutes, what my operation was worth. Not what I did, what it was worth. I told him I didn't generally discuss finances at dinner. He laughed, like that was charming, and then told me, unprompted, that his 3 dealerships had cleared just under $4 million in profit last year. He said it the way you'd say, please pass the salt. Diane nodded like a woman confirming a fact she already knew and was proud of. I watched Hank across the table. He was quiet, picking at his bread, the way he gets when he's unhappy but doesn't know what to do about it. About halfway through the main course, some kind of salmon that Diane had clearly had catered, not cooked herself, Terrence shifted gears. He said he'd heard I was in cattle and that he'd always found farming to be a romantic notion that didn't pencil out in the modern economy. He said was admirable in a way. Old-fashioned. He said the word old-fashioned the way you'd say obsolete. I put my fork down. I said, Terrence, my grandfather started that land in 1951. My father worked it until his hands wouldn't let him anymore. I have worked it every day for 40 years. I have fed my son, paid his college tuition out of pocket, and never asked a single person for a cent. I don't know what you think farming is, but it is not a romantic notion. It is the reason any of us are sitting here eating tonight. The table was quiet. Diane set down her wineglass very carefully. Terrence said, well, now, I didn't mean any offense, I know. I said, and I picked my fork back up. Hank looked at me with something in his eyes. I couldn't quite read right then. I'd understand it later. After dinner, Terrence pulled me aside into what he called his study, which was a room with a lot of books he hadn't read and a bar cart he clearly used regularly. He poured himself a bourbon, not the one I'd brought, which was sitting unopened on the counter, and he made me an offer. He said that he and Diane had concerns about Hank's long-term earning potential and that given the serious direction of his relationship with Sloan, they wanted to propose something. He said he had a contact at one of his dealerships who could bring Hank on in sales management. Good salary, commission structure, benefits. He said it was an opportunity for Hank to build something real. What he meant was something away from me, away from the farm. I asked him if Hank knew about this. He said they planned to discuss it as a family after dinner. I said, he's already building something real. He's been helping me manage our cattle operation and our land leases since he was 16. The boy knows how to read a profit and loss statement, negotiate contracts, manage a crew, and make decisions under pressure. What exactly does selling Chevrolets teach that he doesn't already know? Terrence blinked. I said, I'll let Hank make his own choices. He's 31 years old, but I won't sit here and let you tell him that what he comes from isn't valuable. I went back to the dining room. Hank was helping Sloan clear the table. Diane was on her phone. I told Hank I was going to head out and that it was good to meet everyone. In the doorway, he hugged me. A real hug. The kind he hadn't given me since his mother passed, and said quietly, I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know they were going to be like this. I drove 4 hours home. I thought about what Diane had called me. Dirt poor old fool. Here's the thing she didn't know, and that I'd never told Hank in any detail because it wasn't the way I was raised to talk about money. My grandfather bought that land for almost nothing in 1951. My father held on to it through 2 recessions and a drought in the 80s that nearly broke us. Over the decades, as Nashville grew and the surrounding counties filled in with subdivisions and commuters and development, that land, 800 acres of eastern Tennessee, became something other than just a cattle operation. About 12 years ago, I had the mineral rights assessed. There was natural gas under a portion of the property. I leased the rights to an energy company. That lease, renewed twice, had paid me more per year than most people see in a decade. I'd said nothing about it because it wasn't relevant. The cattle were still my life. The land was still my life. 3 years ago, a regional development group approached me about a portion of the eastern acreage, about 150 acres along the highway that I wasn't using for much. They wanted it for a mixed-use commercial project. I sold it, not all of it, just that portion. What I received for those 150 acres would have taken Terrence's dealerships 11 years to match. I hadn't told Hank the full picture. I'd paid for his education, kept him in trucks that ran well, never let him go without. But I hadn't sat down with him and shown him the balance sheet of what this family actually had. That was my mistake. And it was a mistake that Diane and Terrence had exploited without even knowing it. 2 weeks after that dinner, Hank called me. He'd broken up with Sloan. He didn't say it dramatically. He wasn't crying. He just said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, and that after watching what happened at that dinner, he realized he'd been making excuses for her family for a long time. He said he'd confronted Sloan about what her mother had said at the door, and that Sloan had defended it, had said her mother was just concerned, and that I was being oversensitive. That told him everything he needed to know. He asked if he could come down the following weekend. He showed up on a Friday afternoon with his dog and a bag of dirty laundry, the way he used to do in college. We had steaks on the grill and sat on the porch as the sun went down over the ridge, and I told him things I should have told him years ago. I pulled out the folder I kept in my office, the property assessment, the mineral rights lease, the proceeds from the eastern acreage sale, the investment accounts that had grown quietly in the background for 2 decades while I was doing the work that Diane had called old-fashioned. Hank sat there for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" I said, "Because it wasn't yours to worry about yet, and because I didn't want you making choices based on what I have instead of what you can build." He was quiet again. Then he laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. He said, "Sloan's dad told you that you didn't have real money." I said, "He did." Hank shook his head. He looked out over the ridge. "The man has 3 car dealerships. You have." He picked up the page with the property assessment and looked at it again. "You have more in land value alone than he'll make in 15 years. "Probably," I said, "but that's not the point." "What is the point?" I thought about it for a moment. The cattle in the lower field were moving toward the water tank. The light was going gold and long across the grass. "The point," I said, "is that your great-grandfather bought this land with work. Your grandfather kept it with work. I've grown it with work. None of that stopped being true the minute some woman in pearls decided to call me a dirt-poor old fool. It was never about the money." Hank nodded slowly. "Terrence offered you a job," I said. "Did Sloan mention that?" He looked at me sharply. "No. Her father pulled me into his office after dinner. Wanted to put you in sales at one of his dealerships. Said it was a chance for you to build something real." Hank's jaw tightened. He never said a word to me. He was going to. As a family conversation, he called it. We sat with that for a while. Then Hank said, "I want to be here. I want to learn how to run this properly. All of it. The leases, the land management, the financials. I've been thinking about it for a while. I just didn't know if you wanted the help." I looked at my son. 31 years old, my mother's eyes, hands that were starting to show the same work lines mine did at his age. I said, "I've been waiting for you to ask. There is something that people who have never worked land don't understand about it. It is not romantic. It is not old-fashioned. It is the ground-level understanding that things take time, that patience is not passivity, that what looks like nothing on the surface can run deep. You do not get that from a sales floor. You do not get it from a commission structure. You get it from standing in a field at dawn when the frost hasn't lifted yet, and knowing that everything that happens next depends on decisions you make right now with imperfect information and tired hands. My grandfather knew that. My father knew it. I know it. And I watched Hank, over the next several months, begin to know it too. Last spring, he negotiated our first grazing lease with a neighbor to the south. He found an error in our mineral rights contract that had been underpaying us by about 12% for 2 years. He drove 4 hours to Nashville for a meeting with a development firm that had approached us about the northern parcel. And he drove back having told them no, at least for now, because the terms weren't right. He called me from the road on the way home and said, "I think I understand now why you don't just take the first offer." I said, "It took me 10 years to learn that. You got there faster." He laughed. "I had a better teacher. I don't know what became of Diane and Terrence. I assume they are still in their tan brick house with the 3-car garage, still telling people at tennis clubs about their daughter's dating life. I hope Sloane finds someone who is right for her. I mean that without bitterness. She was not a bad person. She had just learned from people who measured everything in the wrong units. What I know is this: the week after Hank came back to the farm, I found the bottle of Tennessee whiskey I had brought to that dinner sitting in a paper bag by my front door. Hank had gone back and gotten it from their house when he collected his things. He set it on my kitchen table and said, "I figured you should be the one to open it." We drank it that evening on the porch, the two of us, watching the cattle come in for the night across land that had been in our family for 70 years. Dirt poor old fool. Diane had no idea what she was looking at, and that, in the end, was her loss entirely. I still think about that October evening sometimes, not with anger, that passed a long time ago, but with something quieter, a kind of recognition. Diane looked at my truck and saw failure. She looked at my boots and saw irrelevance. She looked at 40 years of work and called it nothing before I had even walked through her door. And the thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong about what she saw. I did drive an old pickup. My hands do look the way they look. I am not a man who walks into a room and commands it. I never learned to. I never wanted to. What Diane couldn't see, what people like Diane are almost structurally unable to see, is that character doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Every morning, I got up before dawn and did what needed doing. Not because someone was watching, not because there was a reward at the end of that particular day, but because that is what the work required. That consistency over decades is what built something real, not the balance sheet, the discipline behind it. That's the part that can't be faked and can't be bought. I've watched men with a lot of money make very bad decisions because they never had to sit with a hard choice long enough to understand it. Terrence wanted to hand Hank a salary and a title and call it opportunity. What he was really offering was a shortcut past the very education that makes a person trustworthy, the kind of judgment that comes from managing something that can fail, that requires patience, that doesn't pay off until you've earned the right to collect. You don't get that from a commission structure. You get it from years of showing up when it's difficult and staying when it would be easier to walk away. Hank understood that, even before he could have articulated it. He grew up watching someone he trusted do the unglamorous thing, consistently, without complaint. That shaped how he thinks. When he found that error in our mineral rights contract, 12% underpayment for 2 years, he didn't stumble onto it by accident. He found it because he'd trained himself to look carefully, to question what he was told, to trust the numbers over the presentation. That's not talent. That's a habit of mind built slowly over time. And then there's what he did at that door. When he pushed past Sloane and her mother and put his hand on my shoulder and said out loud that I was the most important person at that table. I won't pretend that didn't mean something to me. It meant everything. Not because I needed the defense, but because it told me who my son was. That he had the spine to say a true thing in a room full of people waiting for him to go along. That's what I hope people take from all of this. Not the land value, not the mineral rights, not any of the financial details. Those are just numbers. What matters is the 3 things I tried to model for Hank without ever calling them lessons. Doing right by people even when no one's keeping score, thinking carefully before acting and acting carefully after thinking, and holding on through the years when nothing seemed to be working. Diane called me a dirt poor old fool. She was measuring me in the only unit she knew. She had no idea what she was looking at.